In this module, we'll be discussing market imperfections, which are often referred to as market failures. First, among these imperfections are natural monopolies and natural oligopolies resulting from too small a market to enable a significant number of firms to achieve efficiency in production, and this leads to the remaining firms possessing significant market power. Again, this is to the detriment of the consumer. Monopoly means a single seller or no competition in selling, while monopsony means a single buyer and no competition in buying. Technically, there should be no close substitutes to the good or service in question regarding monopolies. This leads to the violation of economic welfare conditions of both equity and efficiency. Monopsony, similar to oligopsony, are markets where there are limited buyers. In this case, we would be referring perhaps to a closed union shop where a firm could only buy the productive resource, labor in this case, from a union with whom there is an agreement. Oligopoly means a few sellers, and oligopsony then, of course, refers to a few buyers, giving rise to market power, resulting in the non-attainment of the welfare conditions, again, of equity and efficiency. Similar to monopoly, we have a situation where the productive resources, labor, physical capital, entrepreneurship, and land are receiving in excess of their opportunity level of compensation. This speaks to equity. And market prices being higher and production of goods and services being lower than otherwise would be the case, highlighting the failure to achieve efficiency. Oligopolistic markets would include such things as the auto industry, perhaps an airline producing industry like Boeing or Airbus and so on and so forth, where there are relatively few producers and there are significant barriers to entry in terms of the high startup cost. Next, we will highlight externalities. Another imperfection is the presence of external benefits and costs that prevent full information from impacting the operation of these markets. And that leads government into intervening in such areas as education and pollution. Education being benefit, pollution being cost, and we'll get into that in a minute. External benefits or positive externalities are goods or services in which the benefits to the society as a whole are greater, again, emphasis on greater, than the benefits perceived by the buyer. This results in a less than optimal level of production. Political discernment by legislative bodies attempt to internalize this external benefit by increasing its level of production through subsidizing the user, subsidizing the producer, or perhaps even government producing it. This would be the term for this with government production would be a public good. External benefits are associated with demand-side failures in general. That is to say that the market is not producing the amount of goods and or services society desires. Again, public education is an example of government intervention in this area. Government failure can arise or arises when political discernment process or its execution fails to achieve the optimal level and might even leave society worse off than if no government intervention had occurred in the first place. When external cost or negative externalities exist, the firm does not bear all the cost of society and thus prices its product too low, resulting in overproduction or greater than the optimal levels in light of all the cost, internal and external. Electric power is usually cited as such an example. Legislation attempts to correct the problem by reducing the excessive pollution by internalizing that internal cost associated with the pollution, and it results in higher prices and brings production toward a more optimal level. External costs are associated with supply-side failures. That is to say that the market is producing more goods and or services at a lower price than society desires because the market price is not capturing the additional cost that is ultimately borne by the society. It is interesting to note that both external benefits and external costs point to suboptimality. Too little in the case of the former, external benefits, and too much in the case of the latter, external costs. These failures give rise to government intervention to attempt to bring these market behaviors more in line with economic welfare conditions. This determination of such policy is meant by is what is meant by the political discernment process, which in itself is often flawed and can lead to government failure. Yet another form of market failure occurs in the form of non-rival goods, which refers to goods and services where the non-payer cannot, in a practical manner, be excluded from enjoying the good or service in question. Military defense and flood control are the cost for those are examples, would be examples. This leads to what's referred to as the free rider syndrome and results in a less than optimal, again suboptimal level of production being achieved in a market. The rundown concerning rivality, non-rival, excludability, and non-excludability can be complicated, but here's a brief list we'll just walk through. First, we have private goods, such as a personal automobile. It would be rival in consumption and excludable. In essence, you control the use of the vehicle with your keys and so on and so forth. The market, pretty much left alone, is fairly good at addressing private goods. Public goods, such as public education, is non-rival in consumption and non-excludable. Think in terms of public schools at the K through 12 level, kindergarten through 12th grade. The free rider syndrome occurs when you can't force someone to pay for the good or service in question. Think fireworks display. You can't very well charge people to pay for going to a 4th of July fireworks event, since the viewing is really only limited by the horizon. Next would be quasi-public goods, which would include such things as toll roads, national parks, where consumption is non-rival. Presumably everyone has access, but there is excludability in that you must pay for the use. Finally, there are common goods, which are rival, private consumption, but non-excludable. You can't keep people out, in other words. A great example of this would be the Grand Banks off the Canadian coast of Newfoundland, a fishery which once had an abundant supply of Atlantic cod. Overfishing resulted in what is termed as a tragedy of the commons. Since the fishery was in international waters, it was off the coast of Newfoundland, but it was outside the international barrier, or the national barrier, excuse me. No one nation controlled it, and the result was intensive fishing, which depleted the stock of cod, and again resulted in the collapse of the entire industry. To follow on, it's actually come back of late, but there have been some international agreements associated with it to try to get the fishery back up and running. So in summary, the production of public goods produced in the public sector would include public school teachers employed in the production of education, referring again to the circular flow of economic activity, the bottom portion of it, while an auto worker would be involved in the production, again, in the circular flow, in the production of private goods in the private sector. So now let's consider the role of regulatory agencies, a form of government intervention in remedying actual market failure or their role in preventing potential market failure. The antitrust agencies are primarily the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. Market failure of this type is due to the excessive concentration of supply in the hands of a few firms attempting to increase their market power and their ability to control that supply and price the good or service in question at restricting supply in essence. It results in downward price rigidity, causing an increase in the instability of the level of economic activity in the form of more frequent, and it can result in the form of more frequent and severe episodes of recession and inflation. We have seen this in the past, certainly. In the real world, a short circuit can and often does occur in markets, preventing the optimal allocation of resources through the supply and demand clearing mechanism. These shortcuts or system failures reduce the ability of free market capitalism to achieve the microeconomic welfare goals of equity and efficiency, as well as the macroeconomic goals of high employment and reasonable degree of price level stability. In economics, the term market failure is usually applied to these shortcomings, both the micro and the macro sense. These failures can range from insignificant to very significant, and such things as the Great Depression and following recessions as well, or the series of recessions following the Great Depression and prior to as well. And it can cause both short and long-run departures from the attainment of those economic welfare conditions again. So let's briefly revisit the concept of the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and their relationship with market failure. Again, from the supply side, market failure in particular. So first, what is the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is the estimate of additional expenditures that the consumer would spend to obtain the same quantity of good or service in question if the firm selling the product could practice perfect price discrimination, which means moving up the demand curve all the way up to the y-axis, up to the having enough control over this that you could drive the price theoretically all the way up to the y-axis is what it really drives, what it's pointing to. So again, how do we measure this consumer surplus? Let's examine the area under the market demand curve. This is where the demand and supply curves intersect, and is where the equilibrium price and the quantity demanded are the same. Recall that price times quantity equals total revenue. Again, price level times the quantity is what you come up with for the total revenue. The triangle above that total revenue rectangle rather is bounded by the demand curve, the price axis, and the equilibrium price. That triangle, again above the price line, is the estimate of the dollar amount of the consumer surplus, what the consumer would be willing to pay, but does not have to. So now onward to the the producer surplus or economic rent. Producer surplus, which is also called economic rent, is a reward to the productive resources in excess of the opportunity cost needed to employ those productive resources, and to the extent of the excess results in the violation of economic conditions of equity and efficiency. So now in this graph we can see market failure. This is the expansion of the producer surplus in the form of a firm exercising its market power in shifting the supply from supply 1 to supply 2, moving closer to the origin, to the y-axis. So we're assuming, of course, that we are in the inelastic range of the demand curve, where increased prices result in higher revenue. Okay. Where once the area of the triangle ABC, moving from left to right on the bottom, A to B to C on the upper left on the y-axis, represented the consumer surplus, is now reduced as a result of the reduction in supply from S1 to S2. As a direct result of this display of market power, the producer surplus is expanded, as illustrated by the trapezoid-shaped portion of the graph. Finally, the small triangle identified on the right as the deadweight loss now appears. So neither the consumer nor the producer benefits from the deadweight loss. But frankly, the producer, it doesn't matter to the producer, because all they're concerned about in this case, of course, is increased revenue. So market failure can occur on the supply side due to the presence of market power, as evidenced again by higher prices driven by restricting supply to increase revenues and resulting in shrinking consumer surplus, increased producer surplus, and deadweight loss as well. This is where the government intervention in the form of regulatory authorities protecting competition should step in to hopefully prevent it from occurring in the first place by blocking market concentration where it makes sense in areas of consolidations and mergers in particular that we're referring to. So finally, in summary, it's important to note that the government intervenes in the following manner. First, in the allocation process, to reorient the product mix in an attempt to move the economy closer to the optimal per capita standard of living, reducing again suboptimality. The discernment process is used to determine the size and the presence of public goods. It's again primarily a political process where much of the decision making is accomplished by legislative bodies at the federal, state, and local levels. Secondly, in reference to the macroeconomic considerations, government's role is to stabilize the economy in terms of economic growth, price level stabilization, and focusing on full employment, the three main areas of macroeconomics, of course. Uh, the fiscal authority, the legislative branches, focusing on taxes, taxing and spending, and the monetary authority, in this case we're referring to the Federal Reserve System, focuses on, they both in conjunction, or at least theoretically, should be focusing on keeping the economy from the pitfalls of recessions and inflation. Uh, and thirdly, so the redistribution of income, the focus again would be the redistribution of income to lessen the impact of inequality in the income distribution. And this is again done through the taxes and spending in the form of transfer payments, and so far as the spending side is concerned, which would be in the form of welfare payments, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP programs, child health insurance programs, et cetera. And lastly, government intervention would be in the form of, so far as taxes are concerned, are often geared toward addressing the issues related to economic growth. This can be in the form of targeting tax policies to affecting economic growth. Again, this could take the form of corporate tax rate reductions, et cetera.